No one saw it coming. Not the diplomats in Paris, not the generals in Washington, not even the satellites above the Sahel. In one night, the sky of Burkina Faso turned into a storm of fire and defiance. A new fleet roared from the darkness, not just metal and engines, but the heartbeat of a people who refused to kneel again. What really happened that night? Was it a military delivery? Or the birth of a new African age? Stay here, because this story doesn't start with war. It starts with liberation. According to official military channels in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has delivered a fleet of Russian-made YAK-130M aircraft to the Bakabi Airborne Brigade. These jets, once known as trainers, have been reborn as combat platforms. Equipped with infrared radars and precision systems that can strike in total darkness. Officials described the delivery as part of a strategic modernization plan. But to those who watched from the streets of Ouagadougou, it felt like something else, the first heartbeat of a reborn nation. The announcement lasted 3 minutes. Yet across the Sahel, it echoed like thunder. Because for the first time in decades, the sky above Africa had changed owners. The roar of the YAK-130M was not just a sound. It was the echo of a century breaking apart. For too long, Africa had been told to defend itself with borrowed wings, planes it could not repair. Radars it could not calibrate, skies it could not truly call its own. Every war was fought under someone else's command, every peace signed under someone else's shadow. But the night those engines lit the sky over Ouagadougou, the story began to change. The YAK-130M, sleek, compact, and unapologetically lethal, was never built to impress. It was built to endure. Its dual engines could rise from short runways. Its radar could see through darkness. Its soul belonged to no empire. To Western analysts, it was just another Russian export. To the people of Burkina Faso, it was something sacred, proof that they could take the sky back into their own hands. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not bring those jets to parade them. He brought them to teach a lesson, that sovereignty is not written on paper, it's carved into the air by those who dare to fly. He called it the rebirth of Burkina's air doctrine. But to many across Africa, it was the rebirth of pride itself. Imagine the scene. Dawn breaks over the Sahel. Dust rolls across the horizon like a tide of memories. In the distance, 6 YAK-130Ms stand lined on the tarmac, engines humming, pilots young but unafraid. Eyes in the sky, boots on the ground. That's the new doctrine. From Mali to Niger. The AES Confederation has rewritten its strategy, no longer reactive, but sovereign. Troops advance through the savannah, not as subjects but as sentinels. And above them, their own flag now guards the sky. These are not just aircraft, they are declarations made of metal. Each takeoff says, we no longer wait for permission. For decades, African armies were built around dependency, aid missions. Peacekeeping operations, contracts signed in Paris, London, and Washington. Every bullet counted had a signature not their own. But when the YAK-130M took flight, it carried something heavier than ammunition, it carried the idea that Africa could defend itself without apology. And that terrified many. Because the world knows, when a people can control their airspace, they can control their destiny. From that day, the Sahel became more than a battlefield. It became a classroom, where soldiers learned not just to fight, but to believe again. In the Bakabi Airborne Brigade, young pilots trained day and night, mastering maneuvers that once required foreign instructors. They learned how to strike fast, how to disappear into clouds, how to land in silence. We fly low, one pilot said, not because we fear being seen, but because we want the people to see us, their sons, defending their sky. That is the essence of this revolution, a military modernization born not of vanity, but of necessity. The YAK-130M became the bridge between dream and defense, a tool that forged skill, discipline, and unity. In its cockpit, sovereignty became muscle memory. When analysts in Washington dismissed it as symbolic, they misunderstood the symbol. The symbol was not the plane, it was the pilot. Because for the first time in generations, African officers were training not to serve foreign missions, but to protect their own soil. This is where the tension begins. Every flight hour added to Burkina's logbook was a nail in the coffin of dependency. And outside forces felt it. They watched the AES Confederation, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, turn deserts into defense lines, poverty into strategy, and isolation into alliance. They called it militarization. But the Sahel called it survival. When nations are left alone to bleed for a decade, self-reliance is not extremism, it's evolution. The YAK-130M was never just an aircraft. It was the mirror in which Africa saw what it could become. If you believe that what is happening in the Sahel is more than war, that it is a lesson for every nation that lost its will, then leave your thoughts below. Because history is not written by victors alone. It's written by those who dare to stand up when everyone else kneels. Burkina Faso has done exactly that. Behind every maneuver of those jets is a story of reinvention. The pilots come from villages scarred by insurgency, families torn by terror. Now they fly above the same lands they once feared to cross. That transformation, from victims to guardians, is the truest definition of sovereignty. And perhaps that's why, when the YAK-130M passes overhead, people stop what they're doing. Children run outside. Old men lift their heads. Because they know that sound, the low thunder rolling across the desert, is not the sound of war. It's the sound of freedom learning how to fly again. That's what the West couldn't predict. That's what no intelligence report could measure. A nation that rediscovers its courage is more powerful than any machine it buys. And from that courage rises a question that shakes the old order. If Burkina Faso can command the sky, who will stop Africa from commanding its future? The war in the Sahel has no front line. It stretches across borders, villages, rivers, and memories, an invisible conflict fought under the relentless sun. For more than a decade. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso were told that terrorism was too vast, too complex, too entrenched to defeat. Western generals called it an infinite war. Diplomats called it a humanitarian crisis. But on the ground, people called it what it truly was, a struggle for existence. The Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, was born not in conference halls, but in trenches. It was forged from failure, betrayal, and blood. When foreign coalitions withdrew, leaving entire regions defenseless, the Sahelians did not surrender. They adapted. What began as scattered militias turned into a united military front. In Mali, the reorganization of command turned chaos into calculation. In Niger, General Abdurrahmane Tiani transformed defense into doctrine, a philosophy of endurance. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré declared that the fight against terrorism was not a campaign, but a cleansing, a moral duty to reclaim every inch of soil desecrated by fear. Together, they formed something unprecedented, a confederation born not of treaties, but of necessity. The AES did not ask permission to exist. It came into being because survival demanded it. Across deserts and savannas, joint operations began to synchronize. Soldiers from 3 nations, once separated by colonial borders, now shared intelligence, air cover, and faith. "We fight as one, or we fall as 3, a Malian officer once said. That became their unspoken creed. In the vast wastelands of the Gourma and the tri-border zone, small detachments began to retake villages long abandoned to extremists. Convoys rolled through areas where government authority had been a memory. Drones, now locally operated, mapped enemy trails. YAK-130M circled above, not to bomb blindly, but to guide ground units with surgical precision. And beneath all of it pulsed one truth: this war would not be won by negotiation. It would be won by resolve. The enemy was not only the insurgent. It was fear itself, the fear that Africa could not defend itself without foreign hands. That illusion began to crumble the day the AES stood its ground. In Niger's northern front, the president himself, General Tiani, walked into the desert to meet his soldiers. Not in ceremony, but in solidarity. "You are the wall between darkness and our people," he told them. "If we fall, there is no one left to stand." Those words spread faster than any broadcast. They became a vow whispered in outposts and trenches. And in Burkina Faso, Traoré made his own stand. He called corruption the mother of terror and began building courts and prisons dedicated solely to it. He understood that no nation could defeat insurgency if its own institutions were rotting from within. For the first time, Africa's war on terror was not outsourced, it was internalized. It became a mirror that forced nations to confront not only the enemy in the hills, but the enemy in their own hearts. Sovereignty, Traoré once said, is not a slogan. It is the price paid in blood by those who refuse to be ruled by fear. That price is being paid daily. From Tilaberi to Gao, from Dori to Menaka, the stories are the same. Farmers return to fields once occupied by militants. Schools reopen with soldiers standing guard at the gates. The call to prayer rises once more, not as an alarm of death, but as the sound of life reclaiming its rhythm. And yet, this war is not over. It is the kind of war that does not end with surrender, but with awakening. The AES fights not only to repel violence, but to rebuild the idea of statehood itself. Because terrorism, in the Sahel, was never only about ideology. It was about erasure, the slow deletion of nations from the map. When foreign commentators talk about instability, they do not understand that instability was imported. What the Sahel is doing now is not rebellion, it is repair. In this repair, a strange beauty emerges, solidarity born from exhaustion. Soldiers share rations across languages. Commanders coordinate by radio through accents, not borders. Each country bleeds. But none bleeds alone. And in that shared struggle, the spirit of Pan-Africanism, long spoken of, rarely lived, finally finds a battlefield worthy of its name. This is what the AES represents, a living alliance. Not a diplomatic gesture. Its anthem is not played at summits, but written in the dust of convoys that never stop moving. The old world sees this as militarization. The new Africa sees it as liberation. For the first time, the people of the Sahel are no longer spectators of their fate. They are the authors of it. And that is why this war, brutal, endless, costly, may yet be remembered not for its pain, but for its purpose. Because somewhere between the burnt villages and the rebuilt ones, between the silence of mourning and the songs of return, a continent has remembered its heartbeat. The Sahel is no longer waiting for rescue. It is rescuing itself. The old world is fading, not with a bang, but with silence. For decades, the map of Africa was drawn by outsiders, red lines and blue bases scattered like scars of forgotten empires. But now, the winds have changed direction. In the deserts of Sudan, in the skies above Niger, and in the councils of the AES, a new reality is taking shape, one that no longer asks permission. The turning point began quietly. While Western media debated democracy and aid, something else was happening. African generals, once trained in Paris and Washington, began signing defense pacts in Moscow. The symbolism was unmistakable. Russia, once distant, now walks openly through the gates of the continent, not as conqueror, but as partner. In Khartoum, Sudan's general commander prepared for a meeting before the Russia-Arab summit, requesting the establishment of a Russian base on the Red Sea coast. For the West, it was an alarm. For Africa, it was equilibrium. Because the truth is simple, the world was never meant to remain unipolar. Empires age. Power shifts. And those who once controlled others must now learn to coexist. In Niger, the echoes of this shift can be felt beneath the uranium mines of Orano, where decades of exploitation turned wealth into poison. The French called it cooperation. The Nigerians called it by its real name, contamination. Uranium, the metal of light, had become a weapon of darkness. Villages near the extraction zones reported sickness. Deformed livestock, dying rivers. Yet the contracts continued, the profits exported, and the silence enforced. When President Tiani told France, "If you wish us well, then leave us alone," it was not defiance, it was deliverance. For generations, the Sahel had been a minefield of dependency, gold for debt, uranium for debt, even democracy for debt. But the era of imposed morality is ending. What Niger demands now is not aid, but justice. The World Bank may call it instability, but the people call it balance, a long overdue reckoning between those who dig and those who bleed. Meanwhile, in Algeria, the seeds of division have begun to bloom, a reminder that the architects of chaos are never immune to it. The Kabylie region, long silenced, now prepares to declare independence. The same government accused of funding separatism in Mali is facing it within its own borders. History, it seems, has a strange sense of symmetry. While the old alliances fracture, the new ones harden. Sudan with Russia. AES with itself. Egypt extending a cautious hand toward the south. Across the continent, the language of dependency is being replaced by a new dialect, one spoken in trade routes. Technology, and defense cooperation. The idea is not to replace one master with another. It is to remove the idea of masters altogether. Russia's involvement in Africa, from the deserts of Mali to the ports of Port Sudan, is not simply military. It is psychological. It reminds Africa of something it had forgotten. That partnership can exist without submission. In intelligence operations, Sudan and Russia have already achieved results, dismantling drone networks built by Ukrainian and Colombian contractors. Each success is more than tactical, it is symbolic. It means Africa can now decide who helps and who leaves. For the first time, geopolitics is no longer about what Africa offers, but about what Africa refuses. And that refusal is changing everything. In Western capitals, think tanks speak of Russian expansionism. But on the ground, villagers in Gao, Dori, and Zinder speak of something else, safety. The security that Europe promised but never delivered now emerges from unexpected directions. The partnerships once demonized as dangerous are proving to be the only ones that actually listen. The old world called it rebellion. The new world calls it realignment. From Ouagadougou to Khartoum, the same conviction spreads: sovereignty is not isolation. It is the ability to choose one's own alliances without fear. The West fears this not because it loses control, but because it loses narrative. For centuries, Africa was the story, never the storyteller. Today, that is no longer true. The continent that once whispered now speaks with thunder. And when Africa speaks, the world trembles, because it knows the age of silence is over. Yet, amid the triumph, the new alliances carry a warning. True sovereignty cannot rest on external pillars, no matter how friendly they appear. If the past was lost to Western domination, the future could still be lost to complacency. The YAK-130M, the AES Confederation, the Russian base in Sudan, these are not the end of the journey. They are the beginning. Because the greatest enemy left to conquer is not France. Not America, not even terrorism. It lies within. And that is where the next chapter begins. If you stand with a continent reclaiming its destiny, don't just watch it happen. Like, share, and raise your voice, because this isn't just a story about Africa. It's the story of every nation learning to rise again. Every empire that fell began not from the outside, but from the inside. Rome had its legions. Mali had its kingdoms. Burkina Faso has its revolution. But corruption is the enemy that speaks your language. Wears your flag, and feeds on your silence. For months after the victories in the Sahel, a strange unease settled over the capitals. The foreign bases were gone, the convoys were returning. The flags of the AES fluttered over liberated ground, yet the atmosphere was heavy. Captain Ibrahim Traoré felt it first. In meetings, he saw the same faces who had bowed to Paris now pledging loyalty to Ouagadougou. The uniforms had changed. The minds had not. The hardest war, he said, is not against terrorism. It is against the rot that hides behind our own walls. That was the birth of the second revolution, the invisible one. Traoré began building what no leader before him had dared: courts for corruption, prisons for corruption, and a moral doctrine that treated embezzlement as treason. He declared that sovereignty without justice is just another mask of oppression. In every province, files reopened. Officers questioned. Ministers summoned. Some called it paranoia. Others called it purification. Because Traoré understood a truth lost to many: a state cannot defend its borders if it cannot defend its conscience. In the new Burkina Faso, wealth was not measured in gold, but in integrity. The soldiers who fought in the desert began to fight again, this time in offices, tribunals, and ministries. The enemy had changed shape, but not intent. For corruption does not die, it mutates. It appears in contracts, in whispers, in the comfort of those who profit from the blood of others. And so, the struggle continues, quieter, but deadlier. In Mali, reforms ripple through the civil service. In Niger, audits become instruments of defense. Across the AES, the definition of security expands, not just protection from bombs, but from betrayal. For too long, Africa's greatest resource was stolen not from its mines, but from its morality. And perhaps, that is what this generation came to restore. The YAK-130M may guard the skies. But the soul of the nation, that must be guarded from within. And in that silence between wars, between explosions and reforms, one question remains. Can a nation truly be free if its leaders are still slaves to greed? The answer is still being written, in the trials, in the prisons, in the prayers of mothers who send their sons not to battlefields, but to rebuild what was broken. Because liberation is not a day. It is a discipline. And if Burkina Faso succeeds, the victory will not belong to one man, but to a continent that finally looked into its own reflection, and did not turn away. The dawn over the Sahel no longer burns red with war, it glows with awakening. The AES stands not as an alliance of armies, but as an alliance of souls. From the ruins of dependence rises a generation that no longer bows. In every soldier's gaze, in every farmer's field, in every mother's whisper, there is the same silent oath: never again shall Africa fight for others before fighting for itself. The YAK-130M still roar across the skies, but beneath them beats something far greater, the heartbeat of a continent rediscovering its will. This is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of ownership. Because freedom is not granted, it is grown, nurtured, and defended by those who dare to believe. If this vision speaks to you, if the rise of Africa stirs your soul, don't let it fade. Like, comment, and subscribe, not for an algorithm, but for a movement. Together, let's keep the fire alive, until every border, every village, every heart knows what it means to be truly free.